Dear friends, thank you for coming today on Friday evening, deciding to join us for the book presentation about monuments and territory war memorials in Russian-occupied Ukraine. The book written by Mischa Gabowitsch and Mykola Homanyuk. He is in Zoom with us. I even saw a couple seconds ago him on the screen, so I'm pretty sure he is with us. And for the discussion, we will also have Bert Hoppe, a historian. He has worked on the transformation of Königsberg into Kaliningrad and on the Holocaust in the German-occupied Soviet territories, and is currently writing a book on Kyiv in the 3040. I hope this book will be also presented here as a good tradition. I given the word to Mischa Gabowitsch and Mykola Homanyuk in their short statement about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I think we need to start with two apologies. The first one is that this was going to be a launch of the print version of the book. The book has been available for free download since December, but unfortunately, as often happens with these things, as the book was already in production, CEU Press was taken over by Amsterdam University Press, which slowed down the whole process, so they still haven't sent us the print copies. But you can download it for free from their website. The other apology concerns Mykola's physical absence, and I will let him explain why he's not here with us in the flesh.
Hello, everybody. The reason is very simple. All Ukrainian men in my age need to special permission to go abroad, and there are just a few ways how to get this permission. One way is through Ministry of Culture, and I also deal with culture and with art, and I decided to apply for this permission. But unfortunately, Ministry of Culture decided to change the procedure of this permission, and they took a break, 2 weeks break, to develop this new procedure, and unfortunately this break was in quarantine, and I unfortunately have no possibility to be with you personally, in person.
Yeah, this literally happened last week, but at least he's larger than me on the screen. Having said that, the organizers asked us to give a very brief overview of the structure of the book, and Mykola has delegated this task to me. So if we can show the short presentation, we can't? Okay, so yes, this is it. Where do I need to point the remote for it to work? Yes, exactly. So I'll just give you a very brief overview of the structure of the book so you have an idea of it. The first chapter is a theoretical introduction that was added at the reviewer's request, where essentially we reflect on how to write about a situation where there are tens of thousands of monuments of a particular type. Because if you look at the literature on monuments in general and war memorials in particular, very often what people do is they take a few well-known examples of large monuments in big cities, and then they generalize from there, which is something that we couldn't do because, as most of you will know, relatively few large cities were actually occupied by the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine. It's mostly rural areas and small towns. And Ukraine is a country, just like all the other post-Soviet countries, where you find a memorial dedicated to the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, in every single village. So Ukraine has several tens of thousands of them, over 40,000. So we needed to think about how to write about what we call the monumentscape. In this case, a monumentscape that consists of literally thousands of monuments, which were all affected in one way or another. Then the second chapter is about the historical background, where, once again, very often when people write about war memorials in Ukraine or monuments more generally in post-Soviet countries, they start from sort of a top-down view, right? They talk about different narratives of the politics of history. They claim that Ukraine is a divided country with one memorial culture in the West and another in the East. And then they sort of go down from there and interpret every monument they encounter as sort of an emanation of one of these big models. We tried to proceed from the bottom up. So instead of starting with these big models, we basically try to simply describe what we find on the ground. And this is mostly, of course, Mykola's contribution, because he is a sociologist and a geographer who has traveled very extensively through every single region of Ukraine and has collected lots of material on war memorials in small towns, villages, etc. And essentially in this chapter, we describe how people interact with war memorials in very vernacular ways. So how they domesticate them, how they start to relate to these official-looking memorials as if they were essentially tombstones for their loved ones in graveyards. We essentially tell this story starting from the early 20th century, really, the early Soviet period, all the way until today. And then we delve into what, that's another example, what happened with the start of the full-scale invasion. So our book essentially covers the first year of the full-scale invasion, from February 22 to February 23, which was our decision simply to keep the material manageable, but also because that was the period when the occupiers were most interested in interacting with war memorials. And one of the things they did is that they started right away to destroy monuments. So some of the damage was collateral, but some of it was intentional. And for example, they specifically targeted memorials dedicated to Ukrainians who died in the anti-terrorist operation. So the resistance against the Russian invasion that started in 2014. But they also sometimes targeted older Soviet war memorials simply because there were inscriptions in Ukrainian, and there are many other cases like that. But what's perhaps even more interesting is that in addition to destroying memorials, sparing some memorials, and if you're interested in which ones those were, we can talk about this in the Q&A, and also stealing some memorials because they claimed that these are really Russian monuments rather than Ukrainian ones. In addition to all of that, they also started building or rebuilding monuments. And this is because one of the justifications for the invasion in a text that was very, very widely circulated in Russia, even at schools, was that the evil Ukrainian nationalists are systematically destroying Soviet heritage in Ukraine, and specifically there was a claim that Soviet war memorials are being destroyed in Ukraine. Now, that is false. That is not something that actually happened, and even though a lot of Lenin statues were toppled after the Revolution of Dignity, and specifically in the decommunization in 2015 and 16, very, very few war memorials from the Soviet period were actually attacked. So what the invaders found when they entered Ukraine were actually intact memorials that were mostly in very good shape, that served as focal points for all sorts of rituals and ceremonies, etc., many of them connected to the Soviet repertoire, Victory Day, various local liberation days, etc. But since they had believed their own propaganda, they now had to come up with a way to show folks back home that they were, in the business of rebuilding monuments destroyed by the evil nationalists. So what they started doing was producing photos and videos of Russian soldiers and their local helpers coming in and rebuilding monuments. Since there was not much to rebuild, what they did was, for example, they started rekindling eternal flames. So they said the Ukrainians have extinguished eternal flames, and Mother Russia is now back to rekindle them. The problem is that, first of all, indeed there were some eternal flames no longer burning, but that's also the case in Russia and other post-Soviet countries. But more importantly, they started installing eternal flames even at memorials where none had ever existed. So many war memorials from the Soviet period were never intended to include an eternal flame, the eternal flame itself was actually quite a late development in the Soviet repertoire. So this led to bizarre phenomena such as temporary eternal flames, where they just came with gas and temporarily set up an eternal flame simply to shoot a video, make photos, to show to an audience back home. But they also started building new monuments to sort of cement and demonstrate Russia's new presence, such as this gigantic equestrian statue of Alexander Nevsky, the medieval Russian knight, who of course had nothing to do with the territory of present-day Ukraine, in the place of an anti-terrorist operation memorial that they had previously destroyed. What's also very interesting, and this is something that really kind of sprang at us when we were looking through all the material that we had collected, was that monuments, this I also need to mention. So what they found on the ground, especially in parts of southern and eastern Ukraine, was this Ukrainian vernacular practice of polychrome repainting. So this is something Mykola has worked on quite a lot. For the past 10 or 15 years, people in these rural areas have been repainting old Soviet monuments in all sorts of garish colors to look like, you know, superheroes or comic book figures. And we interpret this as essentially a way to show respect for these memorials in a situation when there is no longer a central authority that can tell you what's kosher and what's not, right? So they go wild with this, right? And it's meant as a sign of respect. And the Russians initially said, oh no, this is not okay. We cannot tolerate this. After the occupation of Crimea, for example, when they found examples of this practice. But then, starting in 2022, they kind of ran with it, right? And they said, this is something that has only been made possible now that Russia is back in Ukraine, right? So basically, they did something that has been happening for decades in Soviet and post-Soviet history, which is that they discovered a vernacular practice that kind of developed within the official repertoire, but also changed it from within, and started kind of co-opting it into the official repertoire. So especially around Victory Day 2022, there were all these videos on official Russian telegram channels, TV, etc., where they showed local Ukrainians repainting memorials in this way and claimed that this had never happened before and it was only possible because Russia was now allowing them to take care of monuments. What's also very interesting is that both sides in this war use images of war memorials very, very actively in their respective war propaganda, online and offline. And going through all the hundreds and thousands of images that we collected, we started noticing a pattern. Where if you look at this from the point of view of visual semiotics, you notice that in Russian visual propaganda, usually you have these low angles which denote hierarchy, right? So you have the monuments of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, in the background, kind of on an elevated plane. And below them, you have present-day soldiers who very often literally try to copy the pose of the monument. So they try to show themselves worthy of the great ancestors. There's a very clear hierarchy here, right? We are repeating the great feat of our grandfathers who defeated Nazism. Whereas in Ukrainian propaganda, what you see is kind of a selfie-style presentation, right? It's very horizontal, and the person speaking is actually more important than the monuments. So monuments are shown, and there is a sense of visual continuity between fighting fascism then and fighting fascism now. But the two generations are kind of on an equal plane, right? To the extent that you can even cut off a monument statue because what's important is to show the present-day person speaking on behalf of Ukrainian resistance. And there are lots of examples like that. Then we have a chapter where we talk about monument toppling, right? And as I said, there's this Russian claim that Ukrainians have been toppling Soviet war memorials for many years. But in fact, this is something that only started happening more or less systematically in response to the full-scale invasion. So starting in 2022. And it's still something that only happens systematically in some Ukrainian regions and not in others. But indeed, in response to the invasion, in response to this Russian claim that the presence of Soviet war memorials in Ukraine somehow gives Russia a right to be there, to have a military presence there, people across Ukraine and also in some other countries started toppling these memorials. But what's interesting is that I did a systematic analysis of all the countries where this happens, and in the media you'll often find claims such as, all across Europe, Soviet war memorials are coming down in response to the invasion. That's not actually true. So here on this map, you see the relatively few countries, actually 4 in total, where this happens indeed systematically, and we can talk about this later if you're interested. In Ukraine, the situation is complicated. There is kind of a systematic iconoclasm in some regions, but not in others. And there are even some countries, even outside the former Soviet Union, where even since 2022, people have put up new memorials to Red Army soldiers from the Second World War. Right? So it's actually a much more complex situation than is often presented. And then we have a separate symbol. Yeah, we also talk about new monuments being built both in Ukraine and in Russia to memorialize the ongoing war. And in the work that we're doing now, now that the book has been published, we look more closely at how these memorials are articulated with existing Second World War monuments. And then we have a separate chapter where we talk about all the practices and rituals and symbols surrounding the monuments, once again looking in particular at the first annual cycle, which was particularly important, starting in February 2022. And we show how these war memorials were used, especially in Russian propaganda, aimed at local residents, but especially at audiences back home, to kind of project an image of familiarity, because they actually found themselves in surprisingly unfamiliar territory, right? Even though they had thought they knew everything about Ukraine, they didn't. So Soviet war memorials, which superficially look a lot like the ones in Russia, were used to sort of project an image of familiarity, and were therefore used very systematically in all sorts of ceremonies, from giving medals to soldiers, to Victory Day marches, religious ceremonies, etc. And then in the many ceremonies involving children. And then in the conclusion, we talk a little bit about a sort of comparative context. And one thing I found particularly interesting is to think about how to place the Ukrainian case in a larger global context. And what we find particularly interesting about what's been happening in Ukraine for the past 3 years in terms of monuments is that this is a case where there's a shared heritage, right? A heritage from the Soviet period that is now shared between Ukraine, Russia, and other post-Soviet countries, but where Russia claims sole ownership over the meaning of that heritage. And that is actually a time-tested imperial strategy. It's relatively similar to what the British and French did in the 1920s in the Levant, where they said, well, one of the reasons why we have the right to be here and control these territories now that the Ottoman Empire no longer exists is that there are all these crusader castles, right? And these barbaric Arabs and Kurds and all these people living here have no idea how to take care of them properly. So we have a duty to come in and, showcase the Christian heritage of these lands, because we are the only ones who know how to do so, right? And then we kind of speculate about all sorts of other historical cases where similar arguments are put in place. And I think the Ukrainian case is particularly interesting because there's probably no other case, at least that we know of, where there is such a wide range of sort of material remnants of a former empire, which can be used as justification for what we call imperial irredentism. So an attempt to reconquer what used to be part of the empire. I'll stop here, and I'll be happy, along with Mykola, to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. It was short spoiler for the whole talk and for the book, existing already in online, but also hope soon that we can grab this with the hand. So let me introduce properly our speakers. That's, of course, Mischa Gabowitsch, historian and sociologist, is professor of multilingual and transnational post-Soviet studies at Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz, Germany. Online we have, as we mentioned, Mykola Homanyuk, sociologist, geographer, and theater maker, is an associated professor at Kherson State University, Ukraine, and Bert Hoppe, already here, already introduced, and already I'm inviting you to grab the microphone and give a short commentary on this book presentation so we can start a discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk and the overview on this very, very interesting topic. Well, For me, I have to make some remarks because, as you mentioned, I also did some research on memory politics in the Soviet space, and as a German historian and as a historian on the Soviet period and on the Nazi period alike, there are as well as the topics of the war memorials, the World War II memorials in the Soviet context, as well as the Soviet memorialization is very interesting for me. And what struck me very much when I read the book was especially the pluralism of the memorial culture in Ukraine, in post-Soviet Ukraine. Especially when you mentioned the cases when the Soviet war memorials were altered later, and there were several editions starting from Soviet soldiers who died in the Afghanistan wars and then in other wars after 45, and then later with memorials to the people who fought against the catastrophe in Chernobyl and the Holodomor and even the Holocaust. So there are just some cases where this all is together, but the very idea to put these different memorial spaces to one very concrete place struck me very much, and I think this is special, very special for the special Ukrainian approach to the memorial history, and which is makes it so different to the Russian approach, which tries to not in every case erase everything Ukrainian, but to make the history and the perspective to the history more clear. So all the irritation which in Ukraine is discussed, but is accepted, more accepted than in Russia, is very irritating for the Russians. And therefore the changes made in post-Soviet Ukraine to the various war memorials, the repainting, the continuous repainting, is also very interesting. Especially you said that in some cases the Red Army soldiers from Soviet times appeared suddenly to be some superheroes which looked a bit like comic figures. And this shows it's a popular approach from bottom up to these memorials. So they really thought about what they would do. There was nobody who told them what to do with these memorials, or not in all cases. For me, on the other side, it's interesting that contrasting the Lenin part in Ukraine after 2014, there were some cases that they restored Lenin monuments, and as you write in your book, this is quite a contradiction to the official point of view of Putin, who blamed Lenin for constructing or misconstructing, so to say, modern Ukraine, and that he created a problem, what he sees a problem he now has to deal with. So there's also some kind of eclecticism on the Russian side. And in your last chapters, but also going through the book, you often touch the question of social practices with these monuments. And when I did my research on the monuments in Kaliningrad after the war and former Königsberg, I also stumbled across that the inauguration of these monuments, or the re-inauguration, the social practices have been the most important part of these monuments, because when you look especially on Kaliningrad, they had the problem that because of a lack of funds, former Königsberg still lay in ruins way into the 1960s. And so they used these monuments in order to reformat the German cityscape into a Soviet cityscape. They said, well, everything what you see here is not a German city, but it's a cityscape where the Soviet soldier defeated the German army. So, and now, if you look on the occupied Ukrainian territories, where young people and older people, but especially the young people, are forced or take part in these ceremonies. So this is a re-education, and so you can take it as a, more or less, as a re-education where people take part without being forced, but also as a form of humiliation, so that Ukrainians have to take part and have to take the stage where the Russian occupiers tell them how they in future have to look on their history. So, and therefore, from a German perspective, as I said, I worked on the Soviet history and on the Nazi period. In February 22, I was in Kiev doing research in the Ukrainian archives, reading reports from August 1941 on defending the city of Kiev against the German invaders. And there are a lot of toponyms were mentioned in these documents. I read a couple of weeks later in the news, like Irpin, for example, and Bucha, where the Soviet soldiers fought against the Wehrmacht. And then there was a very famous picture on the top page of the New York Times in March 22, where a group of Ukrainian civilians have been hit and killed by a Russian grenade. And in the background of this picture, you could see a Soviet war memorial to Soviet soldiers who died and defended the city against the Germans. So this is, of course, just a, you could say, a superficial coincidence. But for me, it was a sign how multi-layered the history there is, and how we as Germans also have to look on in a different way to these monuments. And therefore, especially, and with this I come to the end, here in Berlin we have also a couple of very big Soviet war memorials. And the way I used to look on these war memorials was that these were mainly a sign for the German defeat and for the suffering of the various Soviet nations within the Soviet Union. But since 2014, when I coincidentally came across on May 9th at the memorial in the Treptower Park, or at the here at the Brandenburg Gate. I've seen then these monuments that became also stage for Russian propaganda in the middle of Berlin. And that I also thought that the monuments I perceived up to this date as some kind of a frozen history, or a history which became cold and processed by our Vergangenheitsbewältigung, became now a very problematic place. And I am still not, I don't know what to do with this, but I think we have to think a bit more about these places too.
And we will talk definitely today. Thank you so much for your elaboration. Let's move then to the question. I would start. If I can ask Kuba to show the first page of the book, it's, I believe, was in the presentation, right? The cover? Yes, the cover. Kuba, could you open the short presentation? Yes, so here it's very interesting, the combination with the flags and what we have on the beginning, then in the middle, and then on the end, if we can read, if we read from the left to the right. My question would be, which path you decided to show with this cover?
I think that's a question for Mykola, because he actually made these photos.
Then could we turn to Zoom? So
this is a picture which I made between Kherson and Zaporizhia region in different times. Approximately 10 years ago, this is the first dimension of this figure of these soldiers, monochrome. This is just made from concrete monument. In 2020, I made a second picture with polychrome, with a banner, blue and yellow colored in Ukrainian national colors. And the last picture I made when I escaped from front line in 2022, and I observed this monument was repainted one more time, of course with red banners instead of blue and yellow. And this cover shows us modifications of this monument, the biography, let's say, of this document, and the biography of monuments, biography. This is quite of our methodology. And this picture, this is a collage, combine methodology approaches and history of monuments in Ukraine.
Thank you. The next question would be also a bit to the methodology, and why have you decided to start to analyze the monuments after the full-scale invasion, not after the 2014 as the first invasion? I do believe that there was erected different, like Soviet, pro-Soviet monuments or monuments in occupied territories. It could be a question to both of you.
So, I mean, we do talk about this a little bit in the historical chapter, but we actually noticed that after 2014, there was some talk about monuments, especially in response to the Lenin fall in Ukraine. But there was not the kind of active monument building and monument management policies that we then found, to our great surprise, in 2022. So in 2022, this really became, I mean, you know, they were fighting on multiple fronts, and at the same time they were diverting resources to rebuilding monuments, destroying monuments, etc. This was really an important part of their sort of, I guess, ideological justification or campaign. So there was just so much more happening in 2022 than before, but also in part than later. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to really focus on this first year, because then after that they gradually started losing interest a little bit in that time.
And how actually you were tracing this new erected monuments? You already mentioned in the points of the performative action, let's call this, around the monuments. It was from Telegram channels, but which like major sources of information have you used to combine, to collect all this information?
The list of our sources is quite long. Telegram, as you mentioned, Telegram channels, one of the most important sources. My personal field work on site, that interview with people, Ukrainians from different part of occupied, Russian-occupied Ukraine, and printed sources, newspapers, and other propaganda stuff. What else? Websites, other internet sources, and I also, after the occupation of Kharkiv and Kiev and partly Kherson region, I also have on-site observation in the occupied territories as well.
Yeah, and Mykola also conducted interviews with, for example, mayors of liberated territories in Ukraine. So it's quite a large range of sources, and I think Mykola is the real star here, because I don't know if this has been made clear, but he was actually in occupied Kherson during the first months of the occupation in 2022, and at great risk for himself, he collected all these sources, and I think the fact that he is so intimately familiar with the Kherson region was really great for our data collection, because he found so much material at different levels in that region through his own observations, through his network of contacts, etc., that then allowed us to understand much better what kind of sources we need to look for in other regions.
Mykola, you was wanting to add something because you were raising the hand.
Yes. I'm just kidding, because Mischa all times exaggerate my personal heroism. Truly speaking, I was not in real danger in this situation. Maybe it's look quite strange, but it's true. To what else I would like to add? Mischa's contribution in work with our sources, because all time we met in Zoom together and discuss what we saw, what we read, and Mischa's view was very important for understanding what to do, else, what would be the next step, etc.
We always play this game in these presentations that we sort of talk about who's exploiting whom. So I always think that I'm exploiting Mykola, because I think he did most of the work, and he thinks he exploited me. But I think maybe you should talk about your bicycle, because that's usually a hit with audiences.
Yes, I am big fan of bicycle, and it's a real life hack how to collect information in a quite dangerous situation. I used my bicycle because I know perfectly my city, and it was quite easy to escape, to be arrested, because my bicycle was all time was faster than occupiers' legs, and it was more like. So I recommend to use bicycle in all
field works.
Yes.
The best advertisement of bicycle in the whole life, I think, which I heard. You already mentioned that they quite usually engage local local people to rebuild or to paint these comic characters. Why do you think it's important for them? Is it just like of the cost perspective, or locals by themselves engaging into that? How this relation between locals and new monuments happening? I addressing this question to both of you.
Just to understand the question, new monuments specifically, or
old one as well? Both, basically.
I mean, one thing I can say is that I think for the Russians it was extremely important to create an image, and this is really, I think this is one of the reasons why maybe Western audiences never really noticed the importance of monuments, because it's mostly propaganda aimed at people back home. But I think for them it was extremely important to sort of create an image of authenticity, right? We are back now, we are being greeted as liberators by grateful Ukrainian residents who suffered from oppression by nationalists from Kyiv, etc. And to prove this, we will show you images of people sort of jubilantly celebrating Victory Day, which I mean, it's something that was used in 1944, 1945, when the Soviet Union sort of incorporated new territories. But what I find particularly interesting about it is that very often these were actually practices that had been going on for years in these regions. I mean, it's not like the Ukrainian government or any regional government banned people from celebrating Victory Day, right? Even after the 8th of May was introduced as a new holiday, people still actually, much more than the 8th of May, continue to celebrate the 9th because it's such a long-standing tradition, etc. So, you know, it's the claim that this was banned and impossible under Ukrainian rule is just false, but they needed to, you know, create these images to prove to audiences back home that people are really grateful. And very often for that purpose, they brought in people from Crimea or from Russia to, you know, act in these scenes.
Can I share my concerns in this matter? For me, it's always very difficult when we are trying to analyze something happening in temporary occupied territories. As, for example, you already mentioned that they are doing some celebration, bringing like youth. And what we also know, for example, from children who are like returning from deportation, that quite often they are forced to do so. And can we assume, are you like leaving the space to assume that those people, locals who are engaging in this, interacting, not like necessary to repaint this as the comic characters, but like joining some, let's call this performative actions, by force? So are these like legit, because that's why like these Telegram channels, it could be different. It could be AI created as well as like just like performance for the camera eye.
Say one thing and then I'll shut up so Mykola can speak. But I mean, for one thing, we actually have, in some cases, videos of people celebrating, let's say, Victory Day before the Russian occupation, and then the very same people basically doing the same thing after occupation. But then one of them is interviewed on camera, and he has to say, well, we are so grateful because we couldn't do this before. But we literally have video evidence that that very person did that before, right? So I think there's both. You know, there is kind of voluntary participation, there's forced participation, and of course, you know, and we write about this, there's the whole practice of literally forcing people to, for example, remove Ukrainian symbols from monuments. And this is being presented as a re-education measure. I mean, this is almost like what the Nazis did in 38 in Austria, right? Where they forced Jews and political opponents to clean the streets, etc. So it's kind of, you know, a performance of punishment through interaction with monuments as a form of bizarre re-education.
Mykola, if you want to add something, give us a sign or speak up.
Yes, I just add one episode from forced engagement when occupiers forced prisoners of war or in civil wear, but in speech occupiers spoke that they are former ATO fighters, and we described this event as one of the events of re-education, forced re-education of people, of Ukrainians, and war memorials were used as a background for this re-education events.
And when we are speaking about some destroyed memorials on which side is built a new one, you're speaking about war memorials, also cemeteries. Does also target can be such monuments as like for Taras Grigorovich, Shevchenko, such monuments? If yes, could you elaborate which exact could be a target for demolition to bring up the new monuments? Or looking at you, Mykola. Maybe you.
All types of memorials dedicated to fighting for independence from the beginning of the 20th century after Russian Revolution to anti-terroristic operation, or almost all, with just a few exceptions, monuments in occupied territory were destroyed or toppled time to time brutally on camera. But what about mentioned Taras Grigorich monuments? It was not an object of our research, but after 2 years of occupation, Russians started to pay attention for Taras Grigorich Shevchenko. According to my information for occupied areas, they started to the fixing of these monuments, paint it not in color, but just in gold or silver color, just to emphasize that maybe in Soviet time, in Soviet time, Taras Shevchenko was one of the accepted by Soviet regime leaders who fight against Tsarism and imperialism and so on. And Taras Grigorich Shevchenko monuments are used to show the acceptance of the idea of friendship between peoples.
Thank you. So before we will move to opening Q&A, I will ask a couple questions which is very worried me, and still no answer being found for this. You mentioned in your presentation that Soviet war memorials or war memorials done by Russia, which represented their perception in the different very strange angles, gives permission Russia to be there. And as we are speaking here, not far away from us, the Stiergarten, Soviet War Memorial, Treptovo Park, Pankov, other cities with numerous particular Soviet War memorials. And basically also like Ukrainian side quite often engaging in this talk. I call this culture politics on remembrance, one style by Melnik and another by Makeyev. Melnik, ambassador to Germany, the previous one, decided to always join the commemoration on site of Soviet War Memorial, particularly the Tiergarten, because for him was important to stress that Ukraine participated in liberation, defeating Nazi. The Makeyev side approach was to deny existence of this memorial until they are representing the aggressor. This question I would like to address to all of you, how you see, how you perceive, particularly as we speaking in Germany, and Mykola almost speaking on site with us, how can we navigate through this heritage in Germany, much more closer to us, much more touchable, not through the Telegram channels, but very, very present and very alive to us? Probably, Mischa, you moved the first.
So a lot of people who work on monuments, James E. Young, who wrote several great books on Holocaust memorials around the world, stress that what makes a monument or a memorial, a functioning one, is that there's a debate around it, right? So the debate, in a sense, is an important part of the memorialization process. And sometimes it's even more important than the materiality. So what I think would be very important in the German case would be to have, a constant plural debate about how different people, different communities, different generations perceive these monuments. So instead of once and for all coming up with a single policy and saying we will destroy them, or we will add, I don't know, information to them, or we will sanitize them in some way, or we will remove Soviet symbols, I think it's important to have lots of different discussions that always take the local context into account. Because even though Soviet war memorials very often outwardly look the same, there are often very different stories behind them. So in Germany, in East Germany, for example, sometimes a memorial was actually commissioned by the Soviet military administration. Sometimes a similar looking memorial was commissioned by the Socialist Unity Party in East Germany for their own reasons, right? Which also affected which memorials were left intact after 1989, which ones were removed, displaced, etc. So I think that's a general rule, right? Instead of having kind of a blanket policy that's decided once and for all, I think in order to keep a meaningful debate alive, it's important to constantly sort of review our relationship with these memorials.
I would like to add that it's crucial the discussion about monument, and for me the lack of discussion from both sides, from people who are against any evidence of Soviet and imperial presence in Ukrainian lands, and who have a different point of view. The lack of this discussion is, for me, it's not very important, but it's what about I'm scared now, because the point is there is no any problems to speak about fighting against Soviet memorials, but it's quite uncomfortable to have another thoughts about.
You mean in Germany or in Ukraine?
I'm talking about Ukraine, and I just would like to emphasize this importance of public discussion about monuments, and actually what I like in German.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I said, from a German point of view, I think that it's important what Mischa just said, that now finally there's a discussion starting, and which could be very productive, a discussion on the monuments, because it sheds light on the question, who were these Soviet soldiers? exactly. And which sheds also some light on the history of the Soviet Union, because in Germany still up to date the Soviet army is often labeled as the Russians, the Russian army, and well, it became better that people you don't hear as often that about 27 million Russians suffered during the war, but then they realized, so most of them, or a large part of them, were Ukrainians, and that Ukraine was, along with Belarus, the only Soviet republic which has been completely occupied by the Germans. So, and but when I bring together the two topics, so the German perspective and now the Ukrainian perspective, you talked about the shared legacy, the shared heritage, also the shared experience of Soviet citizens during the German occupation, serving in the Soviet army. But especially when I look to Ukraine, the history of World War II in Ukraine is very still hotly debated. So if you look on the role of the OUN, of the so-called or real nationalists, on collaboration and on forced collaboration, on the question, was this war against the Soviet-Russian war a part of the liberation war, like the Finns, for example, perceived their war of continuation along with the Germans as a liberation war, and also when I go farther, the question of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which brought the Western Ukraine to today, to the modern Ukraine. So, and these are, I think, very, very delicate, very difficult questions. And I think that looking on how the Soviet war memorials are now perceived in the free Ukraine is very telling about what is happening there, about the approach to the history.
And if not to speak about how Ukraine perceived, but how Germans perceive them. Before you mentioned that it usually was for you more like something on the background, that probably changed also with the start of the full-scale invasion for German debates. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, what I meant with this is that also, well, I think in 2014, for both the Germans and the Ukrainians, we couldn't, or at least I think, we couldn't imagine that the Russians would invade Ukraine. So there was Russian nationalism, there was a nostalgia for the imperial, for the empire. So, but the idea that there would be such a war, even when I was in January, February 2022 in Ukraine, and I didn't ask everyone, of course, what do you think will happen? But so I remember that people told me, well, I can't imagine that there will be a real full-scale invasion, but we couldn't imagine this in 2014. So we have to expect the unexpected. So. But what was the question?
About let's expect something unexpected. Regarding the monuments, how the German perspective, German society perspective changed on Soviet war memorials.
Yeah, and this, well, you talked about the Holocaust memorial that Jack, who was it who said that it was most important the discussion on the very monument? Yeah. So when the Holocaust Memorial was finished, then it became more like a sightseeing site. So it became normal, a place where tourists love to go to. And so were the Soviet war memorials. So for me, it was just interesting to go there, to have a look on these monumental sculptures. But I couldn't imagine that they would be the stage for any foreign propaganda in Germany. And I thought that this would really be a history that was well processed and that was stored in our museums and memorial sites and so on. And now we have to see that these are places which become hot again.
So I actually spent about a decade studying Victory Day celebrations at the Treptow Park Memorial. So every 9th of May, I would go there from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. With a bunch of colleagues and assistants, doing interviews, photos, etc. I co-directed 2 projects where we compared this with what happens at other Soviet war memorials in other countries. One thing I noticed throughout all these years is that there were so many interesting things happening there, which in many ways reflected some of the complexity and the conflicts around the memory and commemoration of the Second World War in the post-Soviet countries, but German mainstream society was not interested. So, for example, when we did a media analysis, there was always this exoticizing discourse, right? It's these bizarre post-Soviet people who have nothing to do with us, even though most of the people attending these ceremonies are actually German residents and many of them German citizens with, you know, a post-Soviet biographical background. This has nothing to do with us. This is kind of a bizarre, you know, commemorative zoo. So we don't need to find out what's really going on. It's enough to simply, you know, every once in a while show some pictures of the night wolves, which are always just a handful of the participants in these events. And I think it's only since 2022 that a larger share of the German population has become interested in these things. And maybe people are now starting to realize that this is also about German society, because I think that, of course, the invasion also revealed a lot of problems with German views of, you know, the history of the Second World War, of responsibility, of, you know, not being able to distinguish between, as Bert said, the Red Army and Russians and Ukrainians, etc. So I think, you know, German mainstream society has to ask itself a lot of questions, and these memorials can be an interesting mirror in which to look at itself.
Would you agree that we need the colonial perspective, or to use the colonial methodology with the work in the Soviet War Memorial in Germany?
I'm kind of ambivalent about this term decolonial, because I think it can be very illuminating and liberating as a perspective, but the way it's often used is it's very simplifying, right? Decolonial means that, you know, I don't know, everything Russian throughout history is bad, and we need to only look at the national histories of the, you know, all the groups that were oppressed by the Russians. And, you know, to a degree that's sort of understandable and justifiable, because there is, of course, a very strong bias still very inherent in the way we talk about, you know, Russian history, Soviet history, post-Soviet history, Ukrainian history, obviously. But I'm not sure that simply applying the term decolonial to something always advances the debate, because as I think our empirical work in the Ukrainian case shows, there are so many different perspectives once you look very closely at what happens on the ground, that just seeing this as a dichotomy between a colonial perspective and a decolonial perspective doesn't really help us understand the complexity of what's going on.
Bert, if you're not going to add something, I want to ask you something. Mykola, turn... No, he just turned off the camera. I hope he turned on this. Kuba?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm just change a gadget.
Could you turn on the camera, please?
I turn on the camera.
Oh yeah, we see you. Great. Would you like to add?
No, I'm not a big special in German issues, so I just listening to this deep interesting.
Great. Bert, you was going to add something, or should I ask you the next question? It would be a bit connected. So you had this perspective on seeing how the Königsberg turned into be Kaliningrad. So you have seen this process of through different like angles of turning to this like Russian, the commemoration of where the Russia is dominating over Soviet heritage. How happened? From where it started, like I know that it's a very big question, but still, how it happened that Soviet turned to be only Russian or associated mainly with Russian?
Yeah, well, one of the main reasons is, of course, because in the last centuries, there were just a couple of years that Ukraine was an independent state, and therefore this Ukraine as an independent nation was not on in the wie sagt man, radar on the radar of the Germans.